I find it fairly interesting that global conflict appears to be on the rise. You know, North Korea is bombing its own facilities. I guess they're joint facilities with South Korea. Putin is pretty much taking over his own country.
We, as the government of the Russian Federation, should provide the president of our country with the opportunity to make all necessary decisions to change the Russian political system. In these circumstances, I believe it would be right for the incumbent government of the Russian Federation to resign.
I want to thank you for everything you've done in this phase of our cooperation.
Tensions with China are on the rise, from India to the US, and yet if you look at Google search trends, people aren't that worried about global war. In fact, the searches for global war or world war have actually gone down. They're trending downwards. It would seem as though people are less concerned with conflicts outside of our country than they are with conflicts inside our country. If you search for the terms civil war has been going up steadily since the very beginning of this pandemic, actually. They started to rise, and then obviously riots and protesters, those types of search terms peaked in early June. What I found to be fairly interesting, though, is the recent peak in search trends for Marxism and Marxist, and that's something I'm going to talk about in this video, because while a lot of people don't seem that concerned about a global war right now, even with the tensions rising as much as they are, it does appear that people are more concerned with civil war. Rasmussen Reports recently did a study on 1,000 Americans, and in the 1,000 Americans that they polled, 1/3 of those Americans thought that we could be heading towards a civil war. That would be 34% in their poll thought that we could be heading towards a civil war. 9% felt like it was likely within the next 5 years. Nearly 10% of Americans think that we could be heading towards a civil war in the next 5 years. 1/3 of them think that civil war could be on the horizon. If you break it down into further stats, 40% of Republicans felt like a civil war was on the horizon, 28% of Democrats, and something around like 38% of independents felt like it was a possibility on the horizon. I actually found it slightly ironic that Democrats were lower in that poll than Republicans. That just shows how the two parties take the severity of the situations at hand seriously, how seriously they take it. I don't think that Democrats take some of the things going on out there as seriously as the Republicans do. Nonetheless, these trends are significant, and I'm going to talk to you guys a little bit about a couple of reports that kind of point to this time frame and a couple things that are going on in society that could be feeding the fuel to this fire. Number one, there was a report that I discussed in a previous video about the Club of Rome. So back in the 1970s, the Club of Rome came up with a computer model that basically simulated population growth and what happens to resources over time.
It's not some science fantasy effect from 2001. This electronic display emanating from Australia's largest computer is a picture of the condition, past, present and future of planet Earth. The program was originally devised by a scientist working from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, Jay Forrester. It was developed under the auspices of the Club of Rome by an MIT research team to present a complex model of the world and what we humans are doing to it. What it does for the first time in man's history on the planet is to look at the world as one system. It shows that Earth cannot sustain present population and industrial growth for much more than a few decades. It shows that simply cleaning up our car exhausts and making some small effort to limit our families simply isn't enough. It's like an electronic guided tour of our global behavior since 1900 and where that behavior will lead us. Down the left-hand side of the graph is the date, 1900, 1940, 1980, 2020, right down to 2060.
That computer model came up with a lot of interesting outcomes. One of the main outcomes of the computer model was that by the 2020s, you'd see a lot of patterns cross. You'd see the availability to grow food start to decline. Oil was supposed to decline in 2008. You'd start to see manufacturing per capita go down, and then you'd start to see the business services per capita go down. You'd start to see a lot of per capita items go down, and as population exceeds there's a number that diminishes because there's less available per capita. And the Club of Rome report was a fairly interesting report because it talked about global conflict. And I personally think that we would more likely see some sort of global conflict or confrontation before we see some sort of civil war here in the U.S. But that doesn't mean that it couldn't happen the other way around. That's just my personal perspective. Basically, what you start to see with the Club of Rome report is by the year 2020, and this was done back in the 70s, you start to see a decrease in health, a decrease in living standards, you start to see a decrease in availability of resources, and all of these things combine to create a substantial amount of social unrest globally. And I do think that we're seeing a rise of social unrest globally. And like I said, I think that we're actually seeing more conflicts out there. And I think that the American people are less concerned with it because of COVID-19, because of everything that we have going on domestically, that they're not paying attention to what's going on in the world. And the world is a very dangerous, scary place at the moment. A lot of people are starting to get very trigger happy. It's not a good situation out there. Nonetheless, people are more concerned with what's happening domestically. I think that the Club of Rome report kind of, if everything that it says comes to fruition, obviously that does create challenges domestically. Now, back in the 1990s, the Clinton administration, during a time that you thought everything was perfect and peachy, the Clinton administration went out and hired somebody by the name of Jack Goldstone to do some background research on what it would take to cause the fail of a state. And his research was basically for any state, any government organization around the world. But what he found, and he worked with Professor Turchin, who some of you may have heard about from an article he published 10 years ago in Nature magazine talking about the potential of a civil war in the United States and unrest peaking around the year 2020. His name has come up a lot recently, and he was a part of this investigation back in the 1990s. And what they determined was that the U.S., in fact, in and of itself, was heading towards a period of social unrest, which could arise in conflict, serious conflict. A couple of the things that they talked about were education, and I'm going to get to that in a minute, the growing public debt, the decrease in standard of living, and then wealth inequality. They even talked about competitiveness between the elites, which we've seen a lot lately as well. So they kind of summarized all these different events that could lead us to a period of social unrest. And again, their timeline was taking us up to 2020. One of the big differences that you'll see between the Club of Rome report and the Goldstone-Turchin report, I don't know if I'm saying Turchin correctly or not, but they both were similar in their crossing paths in the years around 2020, the 2020s. Another interesting event that I think is crossing paths in the 2020s that we should pay very close attention to is the grand solar minimum. A lot of us have done some research on this, and it would appear that throughout history, solar minimum periods are often associated with some sort of conflict, the fall of empires, the change, social change, social reformation, and a lot of that has to do with a change in resources, a change in availability of resources, something that I talk a lot about on this channel. To have all three of these cross paths is fairly interesting, but the Goldstone report is a little different than the Club of Rome report in that it's actually studying more like 50 to 70 year cycles within social norms. So it's basically studying these cycles that we go through. It accurately predicted the Civil War in around the 1860s, 1870s. It's measuring, whereas the Club of Rome is looking at very long-term trends of global population growth and availability of resources, transmission of diseases, things like that. The Goldstone report is actually studying a much smaller cycle, a social and economic cycle, and that seems to be crossing paths at the same time as the Club of Rome report and at the same time as the grand solar minimum events. And so you have three different events which historically would say we're heading towards a period of extreme social unrest. In one of my more recent videos, I talked about the exploding public debt. I've talked about this a lot, actually. I did a 2020 financial crisis video back in mid-December talking about us heading towards a financial crisis in 2020. It seemed a little far-fetched to some people at the time. Pandemic was one of the things that I said could lead us there. Here we are in 2020, we're in the midst of a financial crisis. If you look at the numbers, and this is just staggering to me, globally we have pumped $18 trillion into the global economy over the coronavirus pandemic. And if that doesn't scare you, it should. That's 22% of the world's GDP. In the United States, we're looking at about 39% of GDP being stimulus funds. That's a significant amount. That means that we're pumping money into the economy at an unusual amount to try and keep things propped up. And it's not going to work. It's not working, actually. It's not going to be able to prolong the process. If anything, all of this money being pumped into the global economy could start a period of hyperinflation that we've never seen before. And if we enter a period of hyperinflation, it will further separate the classes, which will further grow civil unrest and social unrest between the different classes. Now, the other thing that they talked about in their report, and Turchin pointed out in his article in Nature 10 years ago, was that we were reaching a point in our global economy and the U.S. economy where the educated college graduates, university graduates were exceeding the demand of the economy. And so what happens when you have a situation like that is it's typically, historically always shown to lead to social unrest. You have a lot of college graduates who are graduating with a degree. They can't find a job that supports their degree, and so they become underemployed. And when you have a bunch of people who are underemployed, that causes depression issues. It causes a lot of issues within society. To give you an idea of this, in 2019, there were 3.9 million college graduates, which doesn't sound like a lot when you look at the enrollment numbers from 2018 at 16.7 million, but 40% of those who enroll in college don't actually make it through college in 4 years. They don't receive a 4-year degree in 4 years. You have a lot that drop out. The point is that you have a lot of people enrolling in college, and then you have this fallout before, people leave college. One of the problems that I see with that is that even people who go into college who don't end up graduating are incurring college debt. And so you have a lot of people starting off their young lives going into a significant amount of debt. And then you have a smaller percentage of them that actually graduate with a degree. But even with that smaller percentage that graduate with a degree, something like 35% of the US population has a college degree. Comparatively speaking, back in 1940, only 4.6% had a college degree. So back in the 40s, if you had a college degree, you stood out. It made you valuable to companies. It almost guaranteed you a job. And we lived by that philosophy for a long period of time. But the problem is between the 1940s and now, the number of people with college degrees has dramatically increased. By 1975, it was up to 13%. By 2000, it was at 25%. And now you're looking at it today at 35%. So with a population that has 35% of us with college degrees, how many of those actually get a job that require a college degree? Only 43% end up with a job that require a college degree. And out of that 43%, 1 in 10 are underemployed within 5 years. And then of the ones who don't get a college degree, who don't get a job that supports a college degree right after graduating, only 1/3 of them within that first 5 years ever find a job that does meet their qualifications. So you have a significant number of people who are graduating with college degrees that are underemployed. Imagine what that does to the psychology of society. You're underemployed and you're in debt. So I think that one of the things that we start to see with something like this is a worker class revolution, a thought process that says, we're not getting what we deserve. We're not getting what we've been trained to expect. We're not getting the things that we went to school to have. This is unfair. The reality is that we've leveled the playing field of competition to the point where there is no difference between one college student and another. And it's also, I think, in some ways, played a role in re-employment of those who have lost their jobs, especially after 2008, 2009. Somebody who had a college education and had experience would normally cost a lot of money to a company to hire, but they could get college graduates coming out of college a dime a dozen. So why not just hire the new guys out of college who have never had a job, have no experience, but they have the education and you can train them the way you want to. In today's economy, we have boxed jobs. So you don't really have to think outside of the box that they put you in. So anybody that has basic education requirements can fit into those boxes, and then they remain in those boxes. 20 years ago, a lot of employers wanted people who could think outside the box. I know that for me personally, when I tried to re-enter the workforce, and this was a while ago now, but I had run my own business for 10 years, and I went and applied for a job that, before I ran my business, if you had a job like that, you were easily making six figures. And they kind of called me back and they said, you're overqualified for this job, so we can't take you. And I was like, well, what does that mean exactly? How am I overqualified? Why wouldn't you hire somebody who's overqualified? And they said, because, you're expecting, a paycheck in this range, but we're only paying $30,000 to $50,000 for this position, so your retention would be very low, which they were probably correct. But at the same time, their reasoning was basically, we boxed this job up, whereas it used to be a position where we needed somebody with your qualifications. Today, we have a cookie cutter plan. They just have to take the instructions, follow them, check the boxes, and that's all they do. Whereas before, it was something where you needed somebody who could actually think through and process. We've dramatically changed the way our economy works, and we've filled it with overeducated people. They're not getting the jobs that even pay for their debt to have that overeducation. So it does create a strain on society. I agree with what they're saying as far as it causing a thought process of a worker class revolution, a stakeholder revolution, because you've taken these people who feel like they're living well below their means. And this is something that we've seen a lot. We've seen a lot of wording lately thrown out there by people like Pelosi and AOC and the Democratic Socialist side of, worker revolutions, stakeholders, attacking the rich, attacking the wealthy. And it becomes a more popular thought process as you have these people who are overeducated, underpaid, underemployed entering the workforce. It creates a frustration that they can relate to, and they follow along with those types of terms. And that's where, I think that the recent trend searches of Marxism are fairly interesting. After Hillary Clinton lost the last election, the Communist Party of the United States of America, CPUSA, posted a PowerPoint presentation outlining how they thought that, with her losing, that was kind of the last hope. They now need to move to Marxism in order to meet their agenda needs. Marxism is where you start to utilize social disturbances, and you build them up and really, push them into social unrest. So when you look at things like Black Lives Matter movement, a lot of that, yes, they're out protesting for a cause that they believe in, but a lot of the social unrest that comes with that is stuff that is propagated by these groups. And they have a whole presentation on how to do it and how to basically take opportunities to cause these type of events and market them and push them to create the social unrest. The underemployed, overeducated philosophy is one of those. The environment is also one of those. In fact, it was the first one on their list. And that's where you have things coming out like the new Green Deal that try and attract attention from those who feel underemployed and try and attract people who feel, racial injustice and create a movement behind it. The new Green Deal does that. Black Lives Matter does that. A lot of these things are taking a lot of those feelings and a lot of those systematic issues and reproducing them to an extremity. So in my research, I think that there's another wave of this that is coming. We've already seen food shortages that have added to all of this, meat shortages. And I'm going to do a different video. I don't know if it's going to come out before this one or after this one. I'm going to record them both around the same time frame. But a different video on what's going on in the global meat market. If you've watched my channel, you've heard me talk a lot about global food supply. And this can relate more towards the grand solar minimum impacts on society than some of these social impacts that we've seen on society. But there's definitely a decrease in standard of living when it comes to food. But I think the next wave is coming in real estate. And I think this is something that we're going to start seeing right now in the next few weeks. In North Carolina, they lifted the ban on evictions yesterday, and legal aid got overwhelmed with calls. This is something that's going to start happening across the country. Why? Because in June, 30% of Americans missed their housing payment. That was down 1% from May, 31% missed in May, and 28% in April. But that is a staggering number of people that are missing their housing payments. Now, granted, by the end of the month, those numbers are generally reduced into the teens as people catch up payments. But as we know, when you get behind on debt, you can only play catch up for so long before it becomes a hopeless task. When we talk about social unrest and the way that people are thinking and feeling, which leads to more civil unrest. So a poll by OnePoll and the National Association of Realtors showed that 52% of people were worried about losing their home. 52%. 47% had considered selling their home after the COVID-19 pandemic broke out. So that's a staggering number. If you had 50% of the homeowners on the market throw their homes onto the market, that would be an unreasonable amount of homes that enter the marketplace. And these are real stats. These are what people are feeling. These are what people are thinking. And I think that just shows the psychology of what's going on in our country right now. We've had this food issue that I think started last year and has kind of followed through. And if you watch my meat video, I'll talk a little more about the meat supply and food supply. And then you've had this overeducated society that's well underemployed. COVID-19 just exacerbated that situation. You have these groups that are out there really pushing the racial injustice dialogue, but a lot of that, if you watch that PowerPoint presentation, a lot of that is just a part of Marxism, along with the attack on police. Because in order to have a state fall apart, you have to have the policing system fall apart. And that's why the first thing you do is you attack the police. This is by the playbook, and it's something that, I can't make this stuff up. The PowerPoint presentation is there. There are people out there that really want this to happen. In fact, like I said, the search results for rioting and protests have gone down, but for Marxism has gone way up, for civil war has gone way up, for global war has gone way down. So this is what people are focused on right now. This is the thought process that is starting to invade our thoughts. I find some of these housing numbers interesting. I'm going to read some of them to you because it just shows where some of this is going. 81% of the respondents in the poll showed that they were feeling financial distress at the moment. 56% had to reduce their spending for their housing needs. And some of those reductions are even interesting. 71% on clothing, 66% on takeout, 46% on streaming TV, and 45% reduction on food, yet we're seeing food shortages. People cut spending on food by 45%. That 45% isn't including eating out and takeout, because that was included in a different line item. 47% of Americans have been out looking for alternative sources of income. 64% have done something else to try and earn a side income. Maybe they're doing YouTube videos. I don't know what they're doing, but the point is that half of our country is out looking for more funds, which means they're unsatisfied with their current employment situation. That's more than the 30 million people that are unemployed. That means that those who are still employed are saying, we're having financial difficulty. We're not making enough money to meet ends meet. We're having to go out and do something else. 53% of those surveyed said that they have had to sell valuables in order to continue to make their mortgage payments. So 7.5%, somewhere in that range, of mortgages are on a forbearance program, or they have been on a forbearance program. But according to Oxford Economics, they expect up to 15% of mortgage holders to fall behind in mortgage payments, which is an unreal number. During the Great Depression, it was 10%. So that 7.5% on forbearance isn't really giving us a complete picture, because forbearance is a program that people are allowed to be on. When we talk about 30% missing their payments and then it backing off into the teens, I think 11% that actually completely miss their payments. Oxford Economics expects that 11% to increase to 15%. We're already past Great Depression era real estate crashes. It's just all this propping up that we're doing is trying to keep it from happening, but the reality is already there. It's already happening. The numbers are already there. And as we start the eviction process in the next month or two, you're going to start to see some of these realities come into fruition. In fact, Columbia University predicts that we're going to see a 40 to 45% increase in homelessness in 2020. 37% of renters think they're going to lose their home in the next 6 months. 26 or 28% of homeowners think they're going to lose their home in the next 6 months. That is a lot of people to be concerned about housing in the next 6 months. We've seen a 50% increase in serious delinquencies in the last 2 months. I think it may increase 20% in overall delinquencies, which is we're at the highest delinquency increases we've seen since 2011. But none of this compares to just the overall amount of people who are missing mortgage payments. When you're talking about 10% was the Great Depression. We're past that. 11% didn't make their mortgage payment or rent payment at all in June. We're seeing the increase in serious delinquencies. This is going to be an unfolding problem. So given all of this information, when you go back and you look at Goldstone and Turchin's political instability graph, which is kind of the graph that they were showing to show, what would lead up to a period of substantial instability in our state. Increasing intra-elite conflict and competition, a weakening overall state, weakening view of government, a weakening view of police. If you look at all of that and then you look at the political stability index, we are actually heading towards a very similar period to what they predicted we were heading towards at the beginning of the Civil War. And I would say that probably the election period in November could lead to significant turmoil. The best outcome with that would be that either Biden or Trump gets defeated very harshly and they just accept defeat and back down. But chances are whoever loses is not going to necessarily accept defeat graciously. It's probably going to be a very, very close election. I think that a lot of people are watching polls right now thinking that Biden is winning by a long shot. But once they get to debating, I think Biden will fall pretty quick in the polls. And I also think that there's just a lot of people who aren't taking the polls. They're not involving themselves. A lot of what I would consider to be conservatives are most likely focused on other things right now. They're more worried about taking care of their family and self-sustainability than they are participating in polls. So you've got a lot of mixed data out there, and I don't think that the November election is going to be as I don't think somebody's going to slam dunk it, and I think that's going to cause a lot of controversy. I don't know who's going to win. I think that there are a lot of people who are upset with both politicians, and in some cases you're going to see people voting against somebody else just because they don't like their choices, but they're definitely not going to let that guy in office. So even there, again, approval ratings don't really mean that much going into this year's elections, because it's not necessarily about approval, it's about denial. So I know a lot of people are concerned about this. Obviously, it shows in Google searches, Google trend searches. And how do you prepare yourself for a period of instability? How do you prepare yourself for Grand Solar minimum meets the Club of Rome forecast meets the Goldstone Turchin predictions? There is a book, and I would recommend everybody read this book. But in that book, you see a lot of this happen over time, over history, and we've seen it happen throughout history in and of ourselves. But this book documents something a little different, and that book is the Bible. And what it shows us is that those who follow God's law and those who try and live their lives within God's government, the one government that has never failed over centuries, the one law that has never failed over centuries, have been relatively untouched by these changes in our social environment. They've been rather protected. Why? Because they're living by a government that never fails. They're living by a law that never fails. That is a law of love, a law of harmony, a law of justice for all. It is a law of prosperity, a law of constant supply. And so I think as we head into these times of uncertainty, and we want to focus on this stuff, and we want to have this, obsession with watching protests, watching riots, watching what's going to happen with elections, what's the next shoe to fall, is a housing bubble coming. The best bug out bag that we can have, the best way to arm ourselves for civil war that we can have, is by arming ourselves with God's law, arming ourselves with an understanding of our true protector. When I was growing up and we used to get in the car, we used to have something we called the 5 Gs every time we buckled our safety belt. God, good, governs, guides, and guards. That's your ammunition. And I think that a lot of us know that. A lot of us often forget it. A lot of us think that this is a period of revelation, which, by the way, the definition of revelation is awakening. But we think that it's a period of apocalypse, which also the word apocalypse means awakening. But we picture that as the end of the world. We picture that as God's punishment. What we don't ever think about is the fact that in every one of those situations, God's good governs, guides, and guards those who are leaning on Him to do so. It is a sense of dominion that God gave all of mankind, a sense of dominion that our God, our Father, Mother God, is always there to protect us and lead us and govern us. And more importantly, that harmony is a law of God. It is something that we cannot escape. It is something we can forget at times, but it is not something we could ever completely escape. Harmony will always end up reigning in the end. But many of us choose to try and accept some of these, these beliefs that God punishes, and we're all heading towards some sort of, condemnation for who knows what. If you read the comments on my channel, there's about 100 different reasons. I was told the other day that if I didn't kneel to Black Lives Matter, God was going to strike me down. But none of this is true. None of it's fact. None of it's real. And so what we have to do in times like this to completely arm ourselves, the best bug out bag we can have is the Bible. But to completely arm ourselves with God's law of harmony and love, and move forward into the future knowing that there are uncertain times. There are certain changes that will be coming, but it is more of an awakening than it is a reckoning. So hold true to that, because that's really what it is. We should all be learning to become more self-reliant, more independent, self-sufficient. And there's several quotes in the Bible. I looked this up a long time ago. Why are so many Christians turning to homesteading in recent years? And there are a lot of quotes in the Bible about tending to your land. If you read it literally, you would think that God wants us to go out and farm. But what He really wants us to do is go out and mind our own business. Not necessarily remove others from our care, not care about the world, not care about the harmony between races, the harmony between different income classes, but he wants us to tend to ourselves and not get involved in other people's business. It also means to be self-sufficient. Yes, it means to take upon responsibility upon yourself and expect that supply to you will always be endless because you are focused on doing what is the right thing to be doing. I said to somebody the other day, this is a time to be more like Noah than Moses. And the difference is that today, a lot of people think that being like Moses would be going out and leading some sort of revolution. If you actually look at what Moses did, he didn't do that. He just followed orders. He did what he was told to do and harmoniously led his people out of Egypt. They didn't do anything. They didn't have to fight. They didn't have to raise their hands up. God did all of that for them, and He led them out. Noah, he built an ark. He built an ark to protect himself and his family. And I think that right now, that's what we should be focused on doing. And if there is somebody who needs to be a Moses out there, I'm sure they will be led the same way that Moses was led. But going out and causing inharmony, thinking that you're causing a revolution, is not being a Moses. So stay safe. Don't let these things bring you down too much. I mean, the world is always a changing place. It's changed for hundreds of years. Society has changed for hundreds of years. If we do end up in a period where it seems like things are falling apart economically, remember that supply is not something that is divinely created in a currency. It is something that you have a right to, an unlimited supply. And I think that sometimes we allow ourselves to become so focused on what supply should be in the form of a currency that we forget of all the abundances that are out there for us. And a lot of this honing in on inequality between people has more to do with currency than it actually does supply, than it actually does with anything that is a true, real source of supply. We all have an unlimited abundance. We all have an unlimited amount of opportunity. But as long as we're focused on that coming to us in a particular way or means, as long as we're focused on what somebody else has or what somebody else has been able to do, we're not ever going to see that supply and abundance for ourselves, because we're not going to see the opportunities that are right there in front of us. So stay tuned, we'll talk more about this. As long as this stays a topic of conversation, and like I said, I think that we're going to see this thing kind of chug along all the way through November, and there's no telling what's going to happen in November. I think a nation can heal, but it takes a lot of people having that mindset, and unless we help turn things around for society and help people see that changes that are taking place can take place and life goes on, the chances of instability growing are real. They're there. They're something that we should all be paying attention to and be mindful of, to protect ourselves the best way that we can.